أهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام إلى حلقة جديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه ملفاتنا. المعادن ركيزة التحول نحو الطاقة الخضراء، لكن انبعاثاتها أكبر التحديات. ومحطة عالمية مرتقبة في كوب 28. ما هو الجلوبال ستوك تيك؟ معضلة كبرى تواجه عملية التحول إلى الطاقة النظيفة عالمياً. مضمونها باختصار أن التحول يرتكز على استخدام هائل للمعادن، والمعادن يتم استخراجها وتصنيعها بعمليات كثيفة الاستخدام للكربون. وهنا يصبح المأزق: كيف يمكن السيطرة على زيادة الانبعاثات في قطاع التعدين؟ بحسب تقرير لوود ماكنزي، يعتبر قطاع المعادن والتعدين مسؤولاً عن 15% من الانبعاثات العالمية سنوياً، وهذه نسبة كبيرة لكنها مرشحة للارتفاع بشكل هائل. ففي ظل الاهتمام العالمي بتحول الطاقة، سيزداد الطلب بشكل هائل على معادن مثل الألومنيوم والنحاس والليثيوم والنيكل والزنك في الصناعات المرتبطة بالطاقة النظيفة مثل البطاريات والسيارات الكهربائية وألواح الطاقة الشمسية وتوربينات طاقة الرياح وغيرها. وكالة الطاقة الدولية تشير إلى أن الطلب الكبير على المعادن الحرجة أو الكريتيكال مينرالز يدفع شركات التعدين إلى التحول نحو أساليب أكثر كثافة في استهلاك الطاقة. فعلى سبيل المثال، يؤدي الطلب على الليثيوم إلى التحول من أسلوب يسمى براين بيست ريكفري، أي الاستخراج من المحلول الملحي، إلى الاستخراج من الصخور، وهو ما يتطلب 3 أضعاف الطاقة المستهلكة في الأسلوب التقليدي. كما أن الطلب يتحول من الليثيوم كاربونات إلى الليثيوم هيدروكسيد الذي يستهلك طاقة أعلى، والسبب أن هذا الأخير أفضل للاستخدام في صناعة البطاريات الحديثة. جهود تخفيض الانبعاثات في التعدين بدأت على مستويات متعددة، فجميع الشركات الكبرى في القطاع عالمياً أعلنت عن تواريخ مستهدفة للوصول إلى صافي صفر انبعاثات بحلول عام 2050 أو قبل ذلك. كما أعلنت 13 من أصل أكبر 20 شركة تعدين في العالم عن أهداف محددة لخفض الانبعاثات بحلول عام 2030. لكن بحسب وكالة الطاقة الدولية، هناك 3 أوجه للضرر الذي تتسبب به أنشطة التعدين للاستدامة. الأول، استخدام الأراضي، وهذا هو مصدر التأثيرات الأساسية على حياة الناس والتنوع البيولوجي، وقد يؤدي إلى إبعاد مجتمعات بأكملها. الثاني هو استخدام المياه، فالتعدين يستهلك عموماً كميات ضخمة من المياه ويؤدي إلى تلويث مصادر المياه، كما أنه يواجه تحدياً في التخلص من المياه الملوثة. وأخيراً النفايات، فعملية التعدين تنتج كميات كبيرة من المخلفات سواء خلال عمليات الاستخراج أو في مرحلة الاستخدام. هذه التحديات لن تقلل من توجيه الاستثمارات إلى التعدين لمواكبة متطلبات عمليات تحول الطاقة، ولكن تدفع إلى نظرة متوازنة إلى مخاطر الانبعاثات وتحديات الاستدامة في كل مصادر الطاقة بما فيها الطاقة الهيدروكربونية والطاقات النظيفة. مع انطلاق مؤتمر المناخ كوب 28 في دبي في 29 من الشهر الجاري، ستكون هناك محطة عالمية في غاية الأهمية تتم للمرة الأولى في تاريخ الجهود المناخية، وتسمى الجلوبال ستوك تيك، وهي عبارة عن عملية تقييم عالمية لما حققته جميع الدول من المستهدفات المتفق عليها في اتفاقية باريس للمناخ عام 2015 وحتى اليوم، ليتم بعدها إطلاق الجولة التالية من المساهمات الوطنية في المستهدفات المناخية. لشرح هذه العملية وما سيأتي بعدها، قابلت سايمون ستيل، الأمين التنفيذي للاتفاقية الأمم المتحدة الإطارية بشأن تغير المناخ UNFCCC، لنتابع ما قال.
Absolutely. I mean, the global stock take gives the global community an opportunity to look back at the past, recognize where there are gaps, what's been achieved, what hasn't been achieved. But more importantly, it is also looking forward in terms of how those gaps need to be closed. And those are gaps on implementation. That is one very key message, but also in the calls for greater ambition based on the gaps that we're seeing. And the global stocktake, one of its roles as designed by the architects of the Paris Agreement, was for the global stocktake, which concludes this year, to inform the next round of NDCs. So we are expecting parties to respond. What is outlined within the report is pretty stark, but it's what we already know. And we've seen report after report as to the insufficiency of action. What is outlined within the latest report on the stocktake are some of the key elements that parties need to consider, have to consider in the upcoming COP, that will set that path forward as to how not just governments but also non-state actors, how they respond also. And that is in every area. Certainly with regards to the energy transition, which is absolutely critical in decarbonizing our environment, but also in other areas that make up the real economy.
There has been an advancement back in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh with regards to the loss and damage fund. What are we expecting on that front in COP28?
Well, Sharm el-Sheikh called for the establishment of a fund and funding arrangements for loss and damage. It was a historical decision, but work has been taking place with parties over the course of this year and will conclude later this month with the final transitional committee meeting, which is looking at the recommendations that need to be put forward at the upcoming COP for decision on what the elements of operationalizing the fund and the funding arrangements. The discussions so far have been very, very constructive. Parties have been engaged, but there's still some critical issues that need to be answered in this final session. And whether that speaks to who should be eligible, who should benefit from the fund and funding arrangements, the capitalization of the fund, the quantum of resources that will be required and the modalities for disbursement, all still need to be decided. Some decisions have been made, but others are still outstanding. So in terms of expectations, there has to be a very, very clear signal that that resources will be made available in order to operationalize the fund, and all of those modalities will be in place, or at least identified, and a very clear time-bound program for the urgent implementation of those recommendations is in place, so that this fund and arrangements can be established to benefit the most vulnerable.
Back in Glasgow, COP26, we've seen the establishment of the Glasgow Financial Net Zero Alliance. The idea behind it was to rally the financial community into financing the transition and financing mitigation and adaptation. In the last couple of years, there has been, since Glasgow, a backlash on ESG. A few financial institutions have actually withdrawn from this alliance. How do you think, or what do you think needs to be done in order to rally private finance and private capital, especially in an environment characterized with higher for longer interest rates that affects investment returns on clean energy investments?
Well, first of all, the trillions of assets that are under management right now, and the need for the management of those assets to be net zero compliant is absolutely essential if we are to hit our climate targets. And the call for institutions, commercial entities to come forward with ambitious pledges and commitments that are net zero aligned is extremely encouraging, and we saw some very strong signals, as you said, coming out of Glasgow. But what is equally as important is that there is sufficient transparency and accountability of those pledges, those plans, those commitments, to ensure that they are robust and they truly are aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it is important to sift out those who have genuine plans and those who don't. So the quality of those pledges and those commitments is absolutely critical. So we've certainly seen some pressure there of institutions, organizations feeling uncomfortable with that, but it's absolutely essential. And then in terms of what this period requires, it requires leadership. It requires those who have not only good intentions, but are also putting the necessary measures in place for us to meet these net zero targets.
You've called repeatedly for a phase out of fossil fuels. We are hearing from other parties calling for the phase out of fossil fuel emissions. Do you think there are any areas of intersection between the two calls? Do you think there is an area of compromise between these two calls, especially in the upcoming COP28?
The science is clear, and what we need to see, what the science calls for, are deep and real reductions in terms of our global emissions, and that calls for what can be done in the immediate term is the transitioning away from fossil fuels, which are at the heart of the climate crisis. In addition to the transition away, you also need, the other side of that equation is the ramping up of renewable energy and energy efficiency, and it's balancing those two. In terms of emission reductions and focusing on emission reductions, the talk of the role of technology within this very complex exercise, it does have a role to play, but that role right now in terms of maturity of technology, scalability of technology, cost of that technology has significant constraints. So there has to be focus on being able to maximize, optimize the role of technology in terms of reducing emissions. But it is absolutely no substitute for the phasing, the phasing down and transitioning away from fossil fuels, and that's all fossil fuels.
نتوقف الآن مشاهدينا مع فاصل قصير نتابع بعده في مستقبل الطاقة. مقابلة مع بيتر باري الرئيس العالمي لوحدة الطاقة العالمية والموارد الطبيعية في بين أند كومباني. أهلا بكم من جديد إلى مستقبل الطاقة. شركات النفط الدولية أو IOCs وشركات النفط الوطنية تواجه تحديات استراتيجية في تكييف استراتيجياتها وعملياتها التشغيلية للمواءمة مع مستهدفات خفض الانبعاثات. هذه التحديات لها أوجه تتعلق بتوجيه الاستثمار وأوجه أخرى تتعلق بالبحث والتطوير والابتكار التقني وكفاءة العمليات. حول هذا الملف قابلت بيتر باري، وهو الرئيس العالمي لوحدة الطاقة العالمية والموارد الطبيعية في شركة الاستشارات بين أند كومباني، وسألته بداية عن تأثيرات التضخم ومشاكل سلاسل الإمداد وتكاليف رأس المال على الحلول التقنية لخفض انبعاثات الكربون.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. These are real issues, aren't they? They're real issues that emerge in any industry situation where there's a growth and scale, tightening of supply chains. But in this situation, of course, it's at a global level, and the supply chains we're talking about are serving both traditional energy and resource activities as well as new energy and resource activities. So we kind of have a double challenge there. But I think the impact is real. The impact is tackled in two ways. The first of which is you have to ensure that your bang for buck increases at a pace faster than the inflation. So can I push forward the technology, improve the technology at a rate equivalent to or in excess of the background inflation or rising cost of capital behind us? And what does that mean? It means I've got to get the technology better 4, 5, 6% a year over a protracted period of time. I've got to get my capacity to scale those projects condensed into, rather than 5 to 7 year timeframes, 3 to 4 year timeframes. So I think the issue is a real one. It certainly affects all of those participants in the clean energy investment space, but they have tools to tackle that. As I said, the first one of those is about improving technology. These are largely early stage technologies, so we can anticipate improvement. But I think we also have to condense the time frame in which we deliver those projects. And what that may mean is more modularization. Rather than the grand project to solve those industrial scale problems in one go, I have to start to build those repeatable modules. So I think there's some push here for the industry to continue to innovate in what it does, but also how it does it.
سمعنا مؤخرا من عدد من كبرى شركات النفط الدولية من أمثال بي بي وشل عن ما وصفه البعض تراجع عن بعض التعهدات المناخية التي أعلنت عنها في السنوات القليلة الأخيرة، وذلك لمكافأة مستثمريها من التدفقات من إيرادات النفط والغاز. هل تعتقد بأن تلك الشركات قد استنتجت من أن الطلب على النفط سيكون أطول مما كانت توقعته سابقا، وقد قررت هذه الشركات إمداد هذا الطلب؟
Yeah, it's a delicate balance, isn't it? And a lot of it's actually about the narrative as well as the practical activity. So certainly the narrative has shifted. What has it shifted to is the question, and I think we have to pay quite close attention to the detail here. The detail for many of those players who've been talking about their energy transition strategies in 2023 has been to sustain their ambitions, to reduce the carbon emissions from their own operations, to start to develop products that customers, particularly in the energy sector, can consume at a lower Scope 3 level. So I think it's a reprioritization rather than a scaling back of ambition on the low carbon side. On the traditional energy side, it is somewhat back to growth, isn't it? You know, we've seen energy demand in total rising, but particularly in the hydrocarbon sector, energy demand rising. Clean, affordable energy, right? That's the mantra of the transition as well. So these companies are in the business of providing that clean, affordable energy. And if it's in a traditional form, better oil operations and gas operations can be a complementary part of that. But the key here, as you say, is to get the narrative right so that it's well understood.
ولكن البعض يتساءل، هل يجب أن تكون شركات النفط الدولية هي المحرك الأساس لعملية التحول في الطاقة؟ البعض يتساءل بأنه نماذج أعمال هذه الشركات قد تكون غير مهيئة لعملية التحول ومستقبل الطاقة على خلال السنوات المقبلة. ما رأيك بهذا الطرح؟
I think here we have to be clear about what we're good at and what we're not good at. So if you unpick that a little bit and say, what are the IOCs, the big IOCs, particularly good at? They're good at managing risk. They're good at large capital projects. They're good at managing millions of customers. So in that range of skills and experiences, they have a tremendous amount to offer, but in particular to contribute to the energy transition. Where this becomes more difficult is as you look at the envelope of new technology in the clean energy sector broadening significantly, all the way from hydrogen through wind, through biofuels, etc. I think the IOCs have to be selective about where they play, and they have to play in a way that manages their skill set and uses their advantages. And I think we can see that something like sustainable aviation fuels, the industry has to play a big role in that, right? They're fuels providers, they have the technology, and arguably they have the capability.
شركات النفط الوطنية لديها شراكات منذ عقود. الآن الشراكات كانت شراكات تقليدية، والآن تتحول إلى شراكات في الطاقات النظيفة ونزع الكربون. كيف ستكون شاكلة الشراكات المستقبلية مع شركات النفط الوطنية، وما المطلوب لإنجاحها مستقبلاً؟
Yeah, well, partnerships are interesting, aren't they? We occupy space in an industry which is largely run on partnerships. Here in the region, the NOCs, a lot of them run large assets on partnerships, whether in the upstream or the downstream parts of their business. Around the world for the last 50 or 60 years, partnerships have been the foundation stone of moving projects forward, opening up new sectors. So it's a slightly obvious thing to say, well, partnerships has to be a very big part of this next stage of evolution. Now, if I go back 40, 50 years, were those partnerships easy at the beginning? Did they move forward without any discussion or any complexity? The answer is absolutely not. You constantly have to manage a partnership. So those that have been initiated in the last several years to tackle low carbon, I think we just have to understand, need to continue to be worked. Those partnerships to thrive have to have mutual objectives which are very aligned, and in order to keep that situation in that condition, we have to keep working them.
إذن في النهاية هل سيكون بالإمكان زيادة إمدادات الطاقة وبنفس الوقت خفض الانبعاثات مستقبلاً؟
Certainly it's a possibility. I think without doubt we're going to see significant change ahead of 2030 in the reduction of emissions, in the production of clean energy. We see a lot of activity in the area of energy efficiency, but energy demand is growing. We're going to see 102.5 million barrels a day demand this year, and likely more in the future. So we have to use our imagination and our capital and our skill set to tackle end use and reduce emissions in the end use. So I think in the production end, absolutely, end use is a work in progress, but without doubt, that's where the focus of attention will have to shift.
بهذا مشاهدينا نصل إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من مستقبل الطاقة. تابعونا على منصة إكس تحت هاشتاغ مستقبل الطاقة. نلقاكم الأسبوع المقبل، إلى اللقاء.